Okay, today we'll be doing Mori Ōgai's Sanshō Dayu, translated as Sanshō the Steward, I think, in our translation. I think it's been translated twice. The original is Sanshō Dayu, published in 1915 by the great Mori Ōgai, the great, one of the great writers of the Meiji period. Biography. Okay, most of this is on Wikipedia, so there's no point in talking about biography these days, so I'll be very brief. Born in 1862, died in 1922. Okay, so he died in year 11 of the Taisho period. Born before Meiji period, at the very end of the Edo period. Born in Shimane prefecture to a family of physicians, to the daimyo. Okay, so a family of elite physicians trained in Rangaku, which is Dutch studies, and medicine. The field of medicine came through Dutch studies in the Edo period, as you know, along with Chinese medicine, of course. Those two strands inform medicine. Received elite education in the Neo-Confucian classics, which runs throughout his works, right? You can see all kinds of references to the classics in his works. He writes in a kind of rigid, formal Kanbun style in many of his works. In 1872, he moved in with Nishi Amane. This is a name you should remember because he's one of the great reformers of the Meiji period. He's one of the several scholars who imported Western languages into Japanese. So words like shakai, tetsugaku, what else? Kagaku. All these words come into Japan in the Meiji period, and many of them were translated or concocted, invented by Nishi Amane as translations of German terms or French terms in other instances. Mori Ōgai attended Tokyo Imperial Medical School. He became a doctor at age 19. He read late Edo Gesaku fiction. From 1884 to 1888, he was sent to Germany to study. To study European literature and to report back to Japan about what he had studied and what he had found. And the experiences in Germany formed the basis of his famous story, The Dancing Girl, or Mai Hime, which we may read in this class as another assignment. Publishes... okay, a lot of this is on the study guide, so I'm going to be brief and go over it. Modern literature, published Mai Hime, published in 1890, so 6 years after his return from Germany, he published his work Mai Hime, which is based on those experiences. He exiled himself to Kyushu after that, and he was appointed the Surgeon General of Japan in 1907. He served in the Russo-Japanese War as Surgeon General. He translates the works of Goethe, Schiller, Ibsen, Hans Christian Andersen, Hauptmann. His collection of short stories, Shokoku Monogatari, is one of the first anthologies of Western short stories in Japan. It was very influential on a whole generation of writers. From 1912 to 1916, he writes his Rekishi Monogatari, right? And the work we're reading today, Sanshō Dayu, is one of his Rekishi Monogatari, or historical stories. Takase Bune is another. We might be reading that later in the semester. From 1916 to his death in 1922, he writes Shiden, which are similar to Rekishi Monogatari, but they're more literary biographies of actual figures who lived most during the Edo period. And the great example of this is Shibue Chūsai. He's noted for his Apollonian style, his emphasis on rationality, on stoicism, on manly virtues, understatement. Much is left unsaid in his works. Okay. Now on to Sanshō Dayu. The story takes place in the Heian period, which begins in 1794, ends in 1185. So basically 800 to 1200 AD, the Heian period. This takes place in the middle of the Heian period, around the years 1093-1094. As I mentioned, it's an example of Rekishi Shosetsu, right? Its story in very short, abridged form, is actually from a Sekkyo Bushi that appeared during the Edo period. And he borrows the story from that and expands it into this work, right? Okay, some of the provinces that appear in this: Iwashiro, Tsukushi, Echigo, Sado, Tango, Etchū, Noto no Kuni, Echizen, Wakasa. Okay, these are all the old names of provinces, so you want to make a note as you read this. Iwashiro no Kuni, for example, is in what is today Fukushima prefecture. Tsukushi no Kuni is today Fukuoka prefecture in the west of Kyushu, and so forth. So make a list of these kuni. Kuni is the name of is the word for prefecture before the Meiji period, right? A lot of temples appear in this. Make a note of all these particularities of culture as you read. The Jizo Bosatsu, for example, is the guardian of children and travelers. Okay. On your study guide, I have a note about the distinction between Apollonian and Dionysian, which are terms used by Friedrich Nietzsche famously in his Birth of Tragedy to designate the two central principles in Greek culture. That might be relevant to this story, it might not be, really. But just note that a lot of people, when they talk about Mori Ōgai, they use the words Apollonian and Dionysian for some reason. I think it's because he mentioned himself being more Apollonian than Dionysian in a few instances. Okay, now on to the study questions. I think there are 9 in all. Let's walk through them now. Answer all of them. Number 1, give a concise summary of the story. Okay, so unlike his later shiden, or historical biographies, plot is very important in these works of Rekishi Shousetsu, Rekishi Monogatari, right? So plot is central to the story. Give a concise summary of this story, okay? And as you do this, you want to keep in mind what I said in one of my other videos about including only constitutive events when you give plot summaries, okay? So don't leave out all the details, just give an account of the central events of the story. Number 2, despite taking place in the mid-Heian period, the story is very much about the world in which Ōgai lived. Okay, so Japan in 1915, at the beginning of the Taisho period. The world is implicitly about that world. Identify the major themes of the work and explain how they reflect or relate to or engage with his own historical period. Is the story a sort of allegory for Japan in 1915? If so, what corresponds to what? Okay, so in order to answer this question, you will need to look up a little bit about Japan in 1915 and consider it in terms of the themes of this story, right? So we have slaves and masters, exploitation, you have sort of a division of classes, you have gender problems in the story too, right? And these are all sort of reflections, in some sense, of what was taking place in Japan at the time. Number 3, discuss the work's fantasy-like ending, in which all conflicts are suddenly and almost miraculously resolved. Why do you think Ōgai made these alterations to the story? What is the effect of such changes? Does this unexpected happy ending prove that Ōgai was ultimately a conservative or reactionary writer who was paranoid or afraid of social unrest and revolution? Okay? So what is the political message of this, the ending of this story? You can imagine a more revolutionary or proletarian writer reading this ending and possibly regarding it as a cop-out, right? As a facile resolution to fundamental problems of society that Ōgai kind of magically resolves at the end of this story. Is it believable, this ending? Is basically the question. Number 4. Compare Ōgai's story to Mizoguchi's film that was made a few years after the end of World War II. How are they each a reflection of their times? How do they represent different ends of the ideological spectrum? All right, they might not represent different ends of the ideological spectrum. This is something for you to think about, but the themes of the story are quite different. Okay, so in order to answer this question, obviously you need to watch Mizoguchi's great film, Sanshō Dayu. It's one of the classics of Japanese cinema, and it's based on this story by Ōgai, but it emphasizes very different themes, and it's written in a different culture, a different historical context. Okay, so explain how, compare and contrast these two works. Is basically the question. Number 5, discuss the narrative voice. Who is narrating? Is the narrator omniscient? Does the narrator employ mostly showing or telling? We talked about these two important words, literary terms, showing and telling. Diegesis and, what's the other fancy term? I forget. Does the narrator focalize itself on any of the characters? Okay, so there are several main characters in the work. Which character is the narrator closest to? And think in terms of this literary technique of focalization. Does the narrator relate events that are mostly constitutive or supplementary? Okay, so are there a lot of tangents that go off in other directions, or does it stay pretty much aligned with the main plot of the story? In line with the main plot of the story. What style is it written in? Genbun ichi or gazoku setchu, that should say. That's a mistake there. Typo. Okay, so before in one of the other videos I mentioned Genbun ichi, which is the modern vernacular style that became the norm in literature after 1905. And then there's this other style that we saw in, for example, Koda Rohan's Tai Dokuro, called Gazoku Setchu. Which style is this work written in? So in order to answer this, of course, you will have to look, at least glance at the original Japanese work. Number 6. After General Nogi's famous seppuku suicide in 1912, following the death of the Emperor Meiji, Ōgai became rather obsessed with the ideas of junshi and self-sacrifice. Junshi is the idea of following your master into death, right? And the example of General Nogi's suicide is the famous example of that. He followed his emperor into death shortly after the emperor died in 1912. Discuss the theme of self-sacrifice as it is presented in this work. Represented most conspicuously in the two female characters, Ubatake and Anju. Okay, so how do we see this theme of self-sacrifice all the way to death in these two characters? And what is Ōgai trying to say about this virtue, what he considers to be a virtue of self-sacrifice? Okay, number 7 is a question that relates to an addendum that Mori Ōgai wrote to this story, where he explains his views about the relationship between history and fiction, the relationship between historical materials and writing about those materials. Okay, what is his attitude toward his own historical materials? So again, he didn't invent this story about Anju and Zushio from scratch. It already existed, and he used an text, a sort of precursor text that tells this short story of Anju and Zushio, and he expanded on it and elaborated on it. Okay, and in the addendum he explains his view about this issue. Okay, so in order to answer this question, you want to look at this addendum. Number 8. Ōgai describes his own artistic temperament as more Apollonian than Dionysian. What does this mean? What is Apollonian or Dionysian about this particular story, Sanshō the Steward? And finally, we have sort of a general philosophical question. How is human nature presented in the work? What is Ōgai trying to say about human nature, about the various kinds of evil, and so forth? Okay, so I think there are several sort of evil characters or antagonists in this story, and I think they each represent a different aspect or a different face of evil, right? So how do these antagonists of the story, these akuyaku, embody or personify different aspects of evil? Explain that aspect. Okay, that concludes our study guide for this work. If you have any questions, send me an email. Bye-bye.